The bullet tore through the frozen air just inches from Clara's head, shattering bark from the pine tree beside her. She ran harder, her wedding dress, still unworn, abandoned miles behind in a bedroom she'd never returned to. Blood from her twisted ankle left a crimson trail across the snow, leading Victor Harlan's hunters straight to her like wolves following wounded prey. She had three choices: surrender and become a monster's wife, freeze to death in these mountains, or trust the terrifying stranger now emerging from the tree line with ice-blue eyes and a rifle aimed directly at her pursuers. Will she survive? Stay until the end to find out, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The story truly began 48 hours before that bullet, in a valley where money bought everything, including daughters. Clara Whitlock had always known the cost of being poor in a place ruled by the wealthy. The Wyoming Territory in 1887 was unforgiving land where cattle barons carved empires from rock and blood, where men like Victor Harlan owned not just ranches spanning thousands of acres, but the very lives of those who owed him. And Clara's father, Thomas Whitlock, owed him more than any man could repay in a lifetime. It's decided, then. Her father's voice carried none of the authority it once held. Thomas sat at their kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped around a whiskey glass, his eyes unable to meet his daughter's. "You'll marry Victor Harlan come Sunday morning." Clara felt the room tilt. She gripped the back of a wooden chair, her knuckles white. "Daddy, no. You can't." "Can't?" Her father's laugh was bitter, hollow. "I can't do nothing else, girl. I owe that man $12,000. $12,000. The ranch, the cattle, the house, all of it goes to the bank next month unless—" He finally looked at her, and Clara saw something die behind his eyes. "Unless you do this." "You're selling me." The words came out flat, emotionless, though Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged animal. "I'm saving this family." But even Thomas couldn't make himself believe it. Clara's mother, Margaret, stood by the stove, her face turned away, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her younger brother, James, only 14, stared at his boots, unable to witness his sister's sentencing. "He's 47 years old," Clara whispered. "And his last wife died in childbirth," Thomas cut her off sharply. "Natural causes. The doctor said what Victor paid him to say." Clara's voice grew stronger, edged with steel. "Everyone in this valley knows Sarah Harlan died covered in bruises. Everyone knows, and everyone's too afraid to speak the truth." Thomas slammed his glass down. "And what truth is that, Clara? That powerful men do as they please? That the law protects property and profit, not people? I know these truths better than you, girl. I've lived them for 53 years. He stood, unsteady. "You'll marry him Sunday. You'll smile. You'll say your vows. And you'll save what's left of this family's name and land." "Or what?" Clara challenged. "Or you'll drag me to the altar yourself." Her father's hand rose, not to strike, but to steady himself against the table. "Victor Harlan gets what he wants, one way or another. At least this way you'll have a roof over your head and food on your plate. At least this way your brother keeps his inheritance." "My inheritance is my own life," Clara said quietly, "and you have no right to trade it for acres of dirt and grass." She walked out of the kitchen and up the narrow stairs to her small bedroom, each step feeling like walking toward a gallows. Behind her she heard her mother's sobs break free, her father's whiskey bottle clattering against glass. Clara closed her bedroom door and leaned against it, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The wedding dress hung on a hook across the room, expensive white silk that Victor had sent over, along with a note that made her skin crawl. "For my beautiful bride, soon you'll wear my name the way you wear this dress, as proof of who owns you." She'd burned the note in her wash basin. But the dress remained, a ghostly reminder of Sunday's approaching horror. That night Clara didn't sleep. She sat by her window watching the stars wheel across the mountain sky, watching the peaks that ringed their valley like prison walls. She'd lived here all 22 years of her life, never traveling farther than the town of Belmont, 30 miles south. She knew these mountains the way she knew her own heartbeat, their beauty, their danger, their absolute indifference to human suffering. Somewhere in those peaks, she'd heard stories of men who'd chosen wilderness over civilization, trappers, prospectors, outlaws, men who'd walked away from the world and its cruelties to carve out brutal, honest lives in the high country where winter could kill you and solitude could drive you mad. Clara had always thought them foolish. Now she wondered if they were the only sane ones left. Friday morning brought visitors. Victor Harlan arrived in a black carriage drawn by 4 matching grays, accompanied by his foreman, Dutch Keller, and 2 ranch hands who looked more like hired guns than cowboys. Clara watched from her bedroom window as her father hurried out to greet them, his hat in his hands, his posture bent with obligatory deference. Victor stepped down from the carriage with the careful movements of a man conscious of his own importance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his graying hair slicked back with pomade, his mustache waxed to sharp points. He wore an expensive suit that looked ridiculous in the muddy ranch yard, but no one would dare laugh. Not at Victor Harlan. Not at the man who could destroy lives with a word, who'd built his empire on the backs of smaller ranchers he'd crushed and consumed. "Thomas!" Victor's voice boomed across the yard. "Good to see you, my friend. Thought I'd stop by, make sure everything's in order for Sunday's celebration." "Friend?" The word was a knife twisted slowly. Clara's father nodded enthusiastically. "Of course, Victor. Everything's arranged. The church, the reception. And the bride?" Victor's eyes lifted toward the house, scanning the windows. "I trust Clara's preparing herself appropriately." "She's—" Thomas hesitated. "She's young, Victor. A bit nervous, as any bride would be." "Nervous?" Victor smiled, and the expression held no warmth. "How charming! Dutch, remind me to send over something to calm her nerves. Perhaps a bottle of that French wine I've been saving." "Consider it done, Mr. Harlan," Dutch Keller replied. The foreman was a lean, hard man with eyes like chips of flint. Clara had heard stories about Dutch, about men who crossed Victor and disappeared into the mountains, about debts collected with fists and bullets, about a loyalty to his employer that bordered on fanatical. Victor started toward the house, and Clara pulled back from the window, her heart racing. She heard boots on his porch, heard her mother's flustered greeting, heard Victor's heavy tread on the stairs. A knock on her door. "Clara? My dear? Might I have a word?" She wanted to scream, wanted to bolt the door and push her dresser against it. Instead, she smoothed her work dress, steadied her breathing, and opened the door. Victor filled the doorway, his cologne overwhelming in the small space. Up close, Clara could see the broken blood vessels in his nose, the coldness in his gray eyes, the way his gaze traveled over her body, with ownership that made her feel naked, despite being fully clothed. "There's my beautiful bride," he said softly. "May I?" He didn't wait for permission, stepping into her bedroom and closing the door behind him. Clara backed toward the window, maintaining distance. "Your father says you're nervous," Victor continued, moving closer. "Perfectly natural. A young woman, about to join herself to a man of the world. You'll find I'm quite patient with inexperience." "Mr. Harlan—" "Victor," he corrected, reaching out to touch her cheek. "Soon you'll call me husband." Clara flinched away. "I need more time." "Time?" Victor's hand dropped, his expression hardening. "My dear Clara, time is the one commodity I'm not offering. Sunday morning, you become Mrs. Victor Harlan. These aren't negotiations." He stepped closer, backing her against the wall beside the window. "Let me be clear about what's happening here. Your father gambled away his land and his future. I'm offering him salvation, through you. This is business, girl. Profitable business for everyone involved." "I'm not property to be traded," Clara said, her voice shaking but firm. Victor's laugh was genuine this time, genuinely amused. "Of course you are. Everyone in this valley is property of one kind or another. Your father owns land he can't pay for. I own the debt that will take it. You own—" He touched her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Nothing. You own nothing except what I choose to give you after Sunday." His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and Clara saw something dark flicker in his expression, something hungry and cruel. "I've been patient," Victor whispered. "Courted you properly, respected your family's wishes about waiting until marriage. But make no mistake, Clara, Sunday night you'll understand exactly what you've become. My wife, my possession, mine to do with as I please." He leaned closer, and Clara could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the anticipation in his eyes. "And I please quite a lot, my dear. My late wife learned that quickly enough." The threat was unmistakable. Clara thought of Sarah Harlan, who'd married Victor 3 years ago and died within 18 months. Sarah, who'd worn long sleeves even in summer to hide the bruises. Sarah, who'd stopped coming to town, stopped seeing friends, stopped smiling. Sarah, who'd died screaming in childbirth in a locked room while Victor entertained guests downstairs. "I'll make you happy," Victor said, stepping back. "If you're obedient, if you're smart, but if you prove difficult," he smiled. "Well, I've broken stronger wills than yours, girl. Ask my horses, ask my ranch hands, ask your father for that matter." He walked to the door, then paused, glancing back at the wedding dress hanging on its hook. "That dress costs more than your father earns in 6 months. It would be unfortunate if you couldn't wear it Sunday because you'd done something foolish. Something like running." Clara's blood turned to ice. Victor's smile widened. "I see you've thought about it. Good. Think harder. Think about what happens to families who break contracts with me. Think about your brother, young James, smart boy, good with horses. He could have a fine future working my ranches. Or—" the smile vanished. "Or he could have an accident. Mountains are dangerous places. Boys disappear." "You wouldn't—" "I would do whatever proves necessary to protect my investments," Victor cut her off calmly. "You're an investment, Clara, a beautiful, profitable investment, and I always collect on my investments." He opened the door. "I'll see you Sunday, my dear. Wear the dress, smile, say your vows, and remember, I'm not a patient man, but I can be a generous one. Obey, and you'll live comfortably. Defy me." He let the sentence hang. "Well, Sarah defied me once. Only once." He left, his boots heavy on the stairs, his voice booming as he rejoined her father downstairs. "Thomas, excellent visit. Sunday will be magnificent. I'll send the wine over this afternoon." Clara stood frozen by the window, her hands trembling, her mind racing through impossible calculations. She couldn't marry him. She couldn't condemn herself to the life that killed Sarah Harlan. But she couldn't run without destroying her family. Victor had made certain of that. She pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and watched the black carriage pull away, watched Dutch Keller glance back at the house with an expression that promised surveillance, promised consequences for rebellion. That night, Clara's father came to her room. He sat heavily on her bed, his face haggard in the lamplight. "He threatened James," Clara said quietly. "Didn't he? That's why you're really forcing this." Thomas nodded slowly. "Dutch Keller came to me 2 weeks ago, made it clear that if you refuse Victor, if you cause any complications, then the debt gets paid in other ways. James is 14, old enough to work, old enough to be bound to Victor's ranch as labor payment, or old enough to have an accident in the mountains. So you're choosing James over me." "I'm trying to save both of you," Thomas said miserably. "At least this way you'll be alive. I'll be Sarah," Clara interrupted. "Dead within 2 years, covered in bruises nobody admits seeing." Her father's hands clenched into fists. "What would you have me do, girl? Fight Victor Harlan? He owns this entire valley. The sheriff, the judge, the bank, all of them answer to him. If I could take your place, if I could—" "You can't," Clara said softly. "And neither can I." She thought her father would argue, would try to justify the unjustifiable. Instead, he simply nodded, stood, and walked to the door. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what it's worth, Clara, I'm so very sorry." He left her alone with the wedding dress and her terror. Mchats. Saturday evening brought the wine Victor had promised, an expensive burgundy that Clara poured down her washbasin drain. She told her mother she'd drunk it, told her she felt calmer. Margaret Whitlock wanted desperately to believe the lie, so she did. That night, Clara went through the motions of preparing for bed. She braided her dark hair. She changed into her nightgown. She blew out her lamp. And then she waited. She waited until the house settled into silence, waited until her father's snoring rumbled through the thin walls, waited until the moon rose high enough to light the mountain peaks silver against the black sky. Then Clara Whitlock made her choice. She moved quietly, deliberately. She pulled off the nightgown and dressed in her oldest work clothes, a gray wool dress, worn boots, a thick shawl. She packed a small cloth bag with biscuits, cheese, dried meat, and a canteen of water. She took the little money she'd saved over the years, $17 hidden in a tin under her floorboard. She strapped her father's old hunting knife to her belt. She did not take the wedding dress. She did not leave a note. Instead, she stood at her window and looked out at the mountains one last time as Clara Whitlock, dutiful daughter. Then she climbed through that window and dropped silently into the cold Wyoming night as something else entirely. A fugitive. A rebel. A woman choosing death in the wilderness over marriage to a monster. The ground was hard with frost. Clara's breath plumed white in the moonlight as she ran across the ranch yard, keeping to the shadows, moving fast and low. She reached the fence line, climbed over, and headed north toward the mountains. Behind her, the house stayed dark and silent. Ahead, the peaks loomed like the spine of the world, beautiful, merciless, utterly indifferent to her survival. Clara ran anyway. She ran because staying meant dying slowly. She ran because even freezing alone in the mountains was preferable to Victor Harlan's bed. She ran because some part of her, some wild, stubborn part she'd always been forced to suppress, would rather fight impossible odds than surrender to the inevitable. The valley floor gave way to foothills, and the foothills climbed toward the real mountains. Clara's legs burned. Her lungs ached in the thin air. But she kept moving, using the moonlight to navigate, heading for the high country where men like Victor Harlan rarely ventured. She knew the hunting trails from childhood expeditions with her father and brother. She knew where the creeks ran, where the game paths wound through the timber, where the cliffs dropped away into darkness. This knowledge might keep her alive for a day, maybe two. After that, winter would do what Victor couldn't, but at least she would die free. The moon was setting when Clara finally collapsed beside a frozen creek, her muscles screaming, her ankle throbbing from a twisted step on loose rocks. She allowed herself water from the creek, allowed herself a few bites of biscuit. Then she kept moving, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant Victor's men would find her body come spring. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains. Clara was 6 miles from her family's ranch, high enough that the valley had disappeared below the tree line. She found a deadfall pine and crawled beneath it, covering herself with pine needles and her shawl, letting exhaustion drag her under for a few precious hours of sleep. She woke to the sound of hoofbeats. Clara's eyes snapped open. Through the tangle of dead branches, she could see 3 riders moving along the game trail below her hiding spot. Even from a distance, she recognized Dutch Keller's lean frame, recognized the deliberate way he studied the ground, the trees, the mountain itself. They'd found her trail. Already. Fear shot through her veins like electricity. She'd hoped for more time, hoped the search wouldn't start until Sunday morning when she failed to appear at the church. But Victor knew her better than that, or Dutch Keller did. The foreman had probably posted men around the ranch property, had probably noticed her gone within hours. She stayed absolutely still as the riders passed below, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air, their rifles ready across their saddles. She heard Dutch's voice, hard and certain. "She's heading for the high country. Probably thinks she can hide in the peaks until we give up. Stupid girl doesn't know Mr. Harlan never gives up. Never." "Could freeze to death up here," one of the other men said. "Save us the trouble." "Mr. Harlan wants her alive," Dutch replied flatly. "He's got plans for that one. And when he gets her back—" A pause. "Let's just say she'll learn what happens to women who run from Victor Harlan. Same lesson Sarah learned." They rode on, and Clara waited a full hour before moving. When she finally crawled out from under the deadfall, her body was stiff with cold and terror. She looked at the trail ahead, steeper now, climbing toward a ridge that would take her into even harsher country. She had no illusions about survival. The men hunting her knew these mountains. They had supplies, horses, weapons. She had $17, a hunting knife, and desperation. But she also had something they lacked, the absolute certainty that capture meant a fate worse than freezing. So Clara climbed. The morning wore on, and the temperature dropped. The wind picked up, cutting through her wool dress like knives. Her twisted ankle screamed with every step. She followed a creek upstream, knowing water would lead to higher elevations, knowing the hunters would expect her to stay low where survival was easier. She was betting everything on the hope that they'd underestimate her will to climb into country that could kill her within days. By midday, she'd reached a narrow canyon where the creek tumbled over a series of small waterfalls. The walls were steep, offering concealment but also trapping her in a corridor with limited escape routes. Clara hesitated, weighing the risk. Then she heard voices behind her, not close but getting closer. Dutch Keller's men, methodical and patient, working their way up the mountain. Clara plunged into the canyon. She climbed beside the waterfalls, using exposed roots and rocks for handholds, her boots slipping on wet stone. The spray froze on her shawl, adding weight. The roar of water covered any sound she made, but also prevented her from hearing how close the hunters had gotten. At the top of the canyon, she pulled herself over the lip and collapsed, gasping. Her hands were torn and bleeding. Her ankle had swollen enough that she could barely fit her boot back on. She allowed herself 30 seconds to recover, then she moved again, because staying still meant death. The terrain opened into a boulder field, massive rocks scattered across the mountainside like the toys of giants. Clara wove between them, using them for cover, climbing higher. The sky had turned the color of old iron, threatening snow. She was exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. Her vision swam with fatigue and altitude sickness. But she kept moving, kept climbing, kept choosing one more step over surrender. The bullet found the tree beside her head just as the sun began to set. The crack of the rifle came a split second later, echoing across the boulder field. Clara dove behind a rock as a second bullet sparked off stone where she'd been standing. "There," a voice shouted. Not Dutch, one of the other men. "By the big boulder! I saw her!" More shots rang out, wild and angry. The hunters had spotted her, and now stealth no longer mattered. Clara ran, ignoring the pain in her ankle, ignoring everything except the need to move, to survive, to escape. She burst out of the boulder field and into a thick stand of pines, branches whipping her face, roots catching her boots. Behind her, she heard horses crashing through the timber, heard Dutch Keller's voice shouting orders. "Spread out! Cut off her escape routes! She can't have gone far on foot!" But Clara was no longer thinking about escape routes or tactical advantages. She was running on pure animal instinct, a prey creature fleeing predators, knowing that capture meant death disguised as marriage. The pine forest opened onto a steep slope covered in loose scree. Clara started across it, her boots sending rocks tumbling down the mountainside. She was halfway across when her injured ankle finally gave out. She fell hard, tumbling down the scree slope in a cascade of rocks and dirt. Her body slammed into a boulder at the bottom, driving the air from her lungs. She lay there, stunned, tasting blood, hearing the hoofbeats growing closer. "Move," she told herself. "Move or die." But her body wouldn't obey. The pain in her ankle had gone from sharp to unbearable, and when she tried to stand, her leg buckled immediately. She could hear the men now, their horses picking their way down the slope she'd just fallen. She could hear Dutch Keller's voice closer than before. "She's injured. Track the blood." Blood. Clara looked down and saw she was bleeding from a gash on her forehead, from scraped hands, from her wounded ankle. She was leaving a trail a child could follow. Desperation gave her strength. She crawled forward, dragging her useless leg, pulling herself toward a narrow creek that cut through the forest ahead. If she could reach the water, if she could wash away the blood trail, if she could... She knew she was lying to herself. She'd run as far as she could run. Her body had nothing left to give. Clara reached the creek and collapsed at its edge, her hands in the icy water, her vision blurring with exhaustion and pain and the terrible knowledge that she'd failed. She'd chosen freedom and fought for it with everything she had, but in the end, geography and biology had defeated her. The hoofbeats were close now, very close. Clara closed her eyes, waiting for Dutch Keller to appear, waiting for the rough hands that would drag her back to Victor Harlan's possession. Instead, she heard a sound that made no sense, a human voice, deep and calm, speaking from somewhere very close. "Don't move." Clara's eyes flew open. She looked up and up at the man standing over her. He was huge, easily 6.5 feet tall, built like one of the mountains themselves, broad shoulders, thick arms, a body shaped by brutal labor and brutal conditions. He wore buckskin and fur, his dark hair long and tangled, his face hidden behind a thick beard. His eyes were the color of glacial ice, pale blue, cold, and absolutely fearless. In his hands, he held a rifle that looked well used and well loved. Behind Clara, she heard Dutch Keller's horse break through the trees into the clearing by the creek. heard the foreman's sharp intake of breath. "You," Dutch said, and there was something in his voice Clara had never heard before, uncertainty bordering on fear. "This doesn't concern you, mountain man. Ride on." The giant with the ice-blue eyes didn't move, didn't speak, simply stood there like a force of nature given human form, his rifle held casually but ready. "I said this doesn't concern you," Dutch repeated, his voice harder now. "The girl belongs to Victor Harlan. We're taking her back." Still, the mountain man said nothing, but his eyes shifted to Clara for just a moment, taking in her injuries, her terror, the blood on her hands, and something changed in his expression, something decided. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried absolute conviction. "No, you're not." Dutch Keller's hand moved toward his own rifle. "You don't want to do this. You don't know who you're—" The mountain man's rifle came up so fast it was a blur. The barrel centered on Dutch Keller's chest with the easy precision of a man who'd made this motion 1,000 times before. "I know exactly who I'm crossing," the mountain man said softly. "The question is, do you know who you're threatening?" For a long moment, the forest held its breath. Clara could hear her own heart hammering, could hear Dutch Keller's horse shifting nervously, could hear the other two riders moving up behind their foreman. Then Dutch Keller smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "Rowan Hayes, I should have known. Heard you'd gone feral up in these mountains after what happened in Cheyenne." He relaxed slightly, though his hand stayed near his weapon. "Victor Harlan will pay good money for the girl. Name your price." "She's not for sale," Rowan Hayes replied. "Everything's for sale," Dutch countered. "Victor taught me that. Name your price." Rowan's rifle didn't waver. "You've got 3 seconds to ride out of this canyon. After that, I start shooting." "There's 3 of us and 1 of you," one of the other riders pointed out nervously. Rowan's eyes didn't leave Dutch Keller. "I'll kill your foreman first, then you, then the other one before his horse stops running. 3 seconds. Choose." Clara watched something pass across Dutch Keller's face. A calculation, a weighing of odds, a professional assessment of danger. Whatever he saw in Rowan Hayes' eyes made his decision. "Victor Harlan doesn't forget debts," Dutch said quietly. "Or favors. You're buying yourself a powerful enemy today, Hayes." "Not the first time," Rowan replied. "Won't be the last. 2 seconds." Dutch Keller wheeled his horse and gestured to his men. "Fall back. We'll report to Mr. Harlan. Let him decide how to handle this." The 3 riders retreated into the forest, but Dutch paused at the tree line. "She's worth $12,000 to Victor. Think about that, Hayes. 12,000, and you're choosing to protect her for free." He shook his head. "You always were a fool." Then they were gone, hoofbeats fading into the distance. Rowan Hayes waited a full minute before lowering his rifle. Then he looked down at Clara, and she saw his eyes weren't cold at all, just careful, guarded, weighing her the way he'd weighed Dutch Keller. "Can you walk?" he asked. Clara tried to stand. Her ankle gave out immediately, and she fell back against the creek bank with a gasp of pain. Rowan sighed, a sound of resignation and decision mixed together. He slung his rifle across his back, then bent and lifted Clara as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "Where are you taking me?" Clara managed. "Somewhere they won't find you," Rowan said, already moving through the forest with long, steady strides. "Somewhere safe." "There's nowhere safe from Victor Harlan," Clara whispered. Rowan's arms tightened around her slightly. "There's one place," he said quietly, "up in the high country where money doesn't matter and power can't reach. Where men like Victor Harlan are just—" He paused. "Just men." Snow began to fall as Rowan Hayes carried Clara Whitlock higher into the mountains, away from the valley and its cruelties, toward whatever waited in the wild places where civilization ended and something older, harder, and more honest began. Behind them, Dutch Keller's promise hung in the cold air like a threat and a prophecy. Victor Harlan doesn't forget. But neither, Clara thought, as she lost consciousness in the mountain man's arms, do runaway brides. Clara woke to warmth and the smell of wood smoke. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was home in her own bed, thought the past days had been nothing but a nightmare. Then the pain in her ankle flared sharp and real, and memory crashed over her like cold water. The escape, the chase, the mountain man with ice-blue eyes who'd faced down Dutch Keller without flinching. She opened her eyes to a ceiling of rough-hewn logs blackened with age and smoke. Firelight danced across them, casting shifting shadows. She was lying on something soft. Furs, she realized, thick and warm. A heavy blanket covered her, and beneath it she could feel bandages wrapped around her ankle. Clara sat up carefully, wincing as the movement pulled at bruised muscles. The cabin was small, barely 15 feet square, but built with the kind of solid craftsmanship that spoke of someone who understood how to survive mountain winters. The walls were chinked tight against the wind. The fireplace was stone, radiating heat. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and equipment organized with military precision. A rifle rack held 3 weapons, all spotlessly maintained, and sitting at a rough-hewn table near the fire, cleaning a pistol with methodical care, was Rowan Hayes. In the firelight, he looked even larger than Clara remembered, a mountain of a man folded into a space barely big enough to contain him. He'd removed his outer furs, revealing a flannel shirt that strained across shoulders built for hard labor. His hands, scarred and calloused, moved over the pistol with surprising gentleness. He hadn't looked up at her movement, but Clara sensed he knew she was awake. "Where am I?" Her voice came out rough, her throat dry. 6 miles north of where I found you," Rowan said without looking up. "Higher elevation, canyon walls on 3 sides. Only one approach, and I'll hear anyone coming a mile away." He reassembled the pistol with quick practice movements. "Water's in the canteen by your bedroll. There's bread and dried venison if you're hungry." Clara reached for the canteen, her hand shaking slightly. The water was cold and clean, tasting of mountain stone. She drank deeply, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she woke. "Why did you help me?" Now Rowan looked up, and those pale blue eyes studied her with an intensity that made Clara feel exposed, despite the blanket covering her. "Dutch Keller said you belonged to Victor Harlan, said you were worth $12,000. He set the pistol down. "You don't look like property to me. You look like a woman running from something she'd rather die than face." "You don't know what you've done," Clara said quietly. "Victor Harlan, he won't let this go. He'll send more men, better men. He'll send whoever he wants," Rowan interrupted calmly. "Doesn't mean they'll find this place. Doesn't mean they'll get past me if they do." He stood, moving to the fireplace to check a pot hanging over the flames. "You should eat. You've been unconscious for 6 hours. Your body needs fuel." 6 hours. Clara looked toward the cabin's single window, full darkness pressed against the glass. "They could have tracked us. They could be surrounding this place right now." "Storm came in an hour after I got you here," Rowan said, ladling something that smelled like stew into a wooden bowl. "Covered our tracks completely. Even if Keller wanted to search tonight, he'd be a fool to try it in this weather." He brought her the bowl and a spoon. "Eat." Clara took the bowl automatically, but her eyes stayed on Rowan's face. "You knew Dutch Keller. He knew you. He called you by name." "People know people in this territory," Rowan said, returning to his chair. "Doesn't mean they're friends." "He said you went feral after something happened in Cheyenne." Clara took a tentative bite of the stew. Venison, potatoes, wild onions. It was simple, but good, made by someone who understood how to stretch resources. "What happened in Cheyenne?" Rowan's expression closed like a door slamming shut. "Nothing that concerns you." He picked up his pistol again, though Clara noticed his hands weren't quite as steady as before. "You should focus on your own troubles. They're considerable enough." "Victor Harlan was going to marry me," Clara said quietly. "Not because he loved me, because my father owed him money, and I was payment for the debt." She looked down at the stew, seeing instead the bruises on Sarah Harlan's arms, hearing the screams from that locked birthing room. "His last wife died. Everyone says childbirth, but I saw the bruises. I knew what he'd do to me." "So you ran," Rowan said. "So I ran." Clara met his eyes. "I chose freezing alone in the mountains over marrying him. And then you—" She stopped, searching for words. "You faced down 3 armed men for a stranger. You brought me here, bandaged my ankle, kept me alive. Why?" Rowan was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with something that might have been old pain. "I've seen what men like Victor Harlan do to women they consider property. Seen it up close." His hands clenched on the pistol. Swore a long time ago I'd never stand by and watch it happen again, even if it costs me. It will cost you, Clara said softly. Victor doesn't forget. Dutch Keller said as much. Dutch Keller talks too much, Rowan replied. But there was acknowledgement in his tone. He knew the danger he'd bought himself. Finish your stew, then we need to look at that ankle properly. Clara ate, and the warmth of the food began to chase away some of the cold that had settled deep in her bones. She watched Rowan as she ate, studying the way he moved through the small cabin with the efficiency of long practice. Everything had its place. Every action had purpose. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a fortress built by someone who expected trouble and prepared accordingly. When she'd finished eating, Rowan knelt beside her bedroll and carefully unwrapped the bandages on her ankle. His hands, so large they could have crushed bone, moved with surprising gentleness as he examined the swelling. Badly sprained, maybe a small fracture, he said finally, but not broken clean through. You're lucky. He began rewrapping the bandages, adding a splint made from carved wood. Keep weight off it for at least a week. Maybe 2. I don't have 2 weeks, Clara said. Victor will do whatever he does, and we'll deal with it when it happens. Rowan cut her off. His eyes met hers, and there was something immovable in them. Right now you're injured and exhausted. You're staying here until you can walk without screaming in pain. That's not negotiable. You don't understand what kind of enemy you've made, Clara insisted. Victor Harlan owns half the Wyoming territory. He has men, money, influence, and I have mountains, Rowan said simply. He finished securing the splint and sat back. I've lived in these peaks for 8 years. I know every canyon, every trail, every place where an ambush could hide or fail. Money doesn't matter up here. Influence doesn't reach this high. Up here, survival belongs to those who understand the land. He stood. Victor Harlan's empire ends where civilization ends. We're well past that line. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to make him understand the scope of what he'd taken on. But exhaustion was pulling at her again, the warmth of the cabin and the food making her body remember how little rest it had gotten in the past 2 days. The bedroll is yours, Rowan said, seeming to sense her fatigue. I'll take the floor tonight. This is your home, Clara protested weakly. I can't. You can, and you will. Rowan's tone allowed no argument. He was already pulling additional furs from a storage chest, arranging them near the fireplace. Sleep. We'll talk more in the morning about what comes next. Clara lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come immediately despite her exhaustion. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm howling outside, listening to Rowan's steady breathing as he settled by the fire. Questions churned in her mind. Who was this man who lived alone in the high country? What had happened in Cheyenne that made him choose this brutal solitude? And why had he risked everything to save a woman he'd never met? Rowan? She said quietly into the darkness. Yeah? Thank you. For my life. Silence stretched between them. Then, thank me when we survive what comes next. Not before. Clara closed her eyes and let exhaustion finally claim her. She woke once in the deepest part of night to find Rowan standing at the window, rifle in hand, watching the darkness beyond the glass. The storm had passed, and moonlight silvered the snow outside. He stood utterly still, utterly alert, a sentinel guarding against threats only he could sense. Clara wondered if he ever really slept, or if survival in these mountains required constant vigilance. She wondered what it cost a man to live like this, always alone, always watching, always ready for violence. Then she drifted back to sleep, and her dreams were full of hoofbeats and gunfire and ice-blue eyes that promised safety she didn't know if she could trust. Morning brought pale sunlight and the smell of coffee. Clara woke to find Rowan already up, dressed in his buckskins and furs, preparing what looked like a simple breakfast of fried cornmeal cakes and strips of bacon. He worked with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything, and Clara realized this routine was probably identical every morning, solitary, silent, sufficient. "How's the ankle?" he asked without looking up from the pan. Clara tested it carefully. The pain was still sharp, but the swelling seemed slightly reduced. Better. Still can't walk on it. Give it time. Rowan divided the food onto 2 tin plates and brought one to her. Storm dropped 8 inches of new snow last night, covered any remaining tracks completely. If Keller's men are still searching, they're doing it blind. Clara took the plate. They won't give up. Victor will offer rewards. He'll bring in trackers, hunters. Let him. Rowan sat down with his own breakfast. I've avoided worse than hired trackers. Had the U.S. cavalry hunting me once back in Cheyenne. Lost them in 3 days. He ate without apparent concern, as if discussing something no more serious than the weather. The cavalry. Clara stared at him. What did you do? Rowan's face went hard. Told you that story doesn't concern you. I think it does, Clara said carefully. If I'm trusting my life to you, I should know who you are, what you're capable of. You already know what I'm capable of, Rowan replied. You saw me face down 3 armed men yesterday. You're sleeping in my cabin, eating my food under my protection. What else matters? The truth matters, Clara insisted. Dutch Keller recognized you. He knew your name, knew your history. He wasn't afraid of you, but he wasn't willing to test you either. That tells me you have a reputation. I want to know what kind. Rowan set down his plate, his jaw tight. For a moment, Clara thought he'd refuse to answer, would retreat behind that wall of silence he seemed to carry like armor. Then he spoke, his voice flat and carefully empty of emotion. 8 years ago, I was a lieutenant in the cavalry, stationed at Fort Russell outside Cheyenne. I was 26 years old, believed in duty and honor, and all the things they teach you matter. He stared at the fire. My commanding officer was a colonel named Marcus Brennan. Good soldier, everyone said, respected, decorated. What happened? Clara asked quietly. Brennan had a wife, Elizabeth. Beautiful woman, kind. Too kind for a man like him. Rowan's hands clenched into fists. He beat her. Everyone knew it, but nobody spoke about it. Officers' wives were property, same as enlisted men. You didn't interfere in another man's marriage. Clara felt cold spreading through her chest, understanding where the story was heading. I tried to ignore it, Rowan continued. Told myself it wasn't my business, until the night I was walking past their quarters and heard her screaming. Heard him. He stopped, took a breath. I broke down the door, found him choking her, found her face so covered in blood I barely recognized her. What did you do? I pulled him off her. He came at me. So I hit him. Rowan's voice was absolutely level now, reciting facts without inflection. Broke his jaw in 3 places, shattered his collarbone. Would have killed him if other soldiers hadn't pulled me off. They court-martialed you, Clara said softly. They tried, but Elizabeth Brennan testified about what her husband had done to her, showed the court years of scars and broken bones. The judge had to choose, convict me for assaulting a superior officer or acknowledge that Brennan was a monster. Rowan's laugh was bitter. They chose politics, gave me a dishonorable discharge, let Brennan retire for health reasons. Everyone saved face except Elizabeth. Where is she now? Dead. The word fell like a stone. Brennan took her back east, away from anyone who knew the truth. 6 months later, she died in a carriage accident. Rowan met Clara's eyes, and she saw old rage burning there like coals that never quite went cold. No witnesses, no questions asked, just a funeral and a grieving widower who remarried within the year. Clara understood now. Understood the cabin hidden in the mountains, the careful solitude, the instant willingness to face down Dutch Keller for a stranger. Rowan Hayes had tried to save one woman and failed. He'd been punished for it, driven from society, made into an exile. And when he'd found Clara bleeding and desperate by that creek, he'd been given a second chance. I'm sorry, Clara said. For Elizabeth. For what happened to you. Don't be sorry, Rowan said harshly. Be angry. Be furious that men like Brennan and Victor Harlan get to destroy women and call it their right. Be angry enough to survive, because your survival is the only revenge that matters. Before Clara could respond, Rowan's head snapped toward the window. His entire body went tense, predatory, focused. What is it? Clara whispered. Someone's coming. Rowan was already moving, grabbing his rifle, checking the loads with quick, practiced motions. Stay quiet. Don't move unless I tell you. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. How many? Can't tell yet, but they're trying to be quiet. Rowan positioned himself beside the window, angling so he could see out without being seen. Means they're hunting, not traveling. Minutes crawled past in tense silence. Clara could hear nothing over the hammering of her own pulse, but Rowan's entire body remained coiled, ready. Then she heard it, the faint crunch of boots on snow, getting closer. Rowan's rifle came up, barrel resting on the windowsill. His finger was on the trigger, his breathing slow and controlled. A figure emerged from the trees below the cabin. A single man, moving carefully through the snow, studying the ground. He wore a thick coat and carried a rifle, but something about his posture seemed less threatening than cautious. Rowan's eyes narrowed. Then, unexpectedly, he lowered his rifle slightly. "Marcus!" he called out, his voice carrying through the thin mountain air. "You're a long way from your trap line." The figure stopped, looked up toward the cabin, and raised both hands to show they were empty. "Rowan Hayes, heard you might have company." "Heard from who?" "Dutch Keller came through my camp last night. Said Victor Harlan was offering $500 for information about a runaway bride. The man, Marcus, took a few steps closer. Said she might have gotten help from a certain mountain hermit. And you came to collect?" Rowan's rifle wasn't pointing at Marcus, but it wasn't lowered either. "Came to warn you," Marcus said. "Keller's got 8 men combing these mountains. They're working a grid pattern, checking every canyon, every cabin, every place someone might hide. They'll reach this area by tomorrow, maybe sooner." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. 8 men. A grid search. They were being systematic, professional. "Why warn me?" Rowan asked. $500 is good money." Marcus shrugged. "You helped me through that blizzard 2 winters back. Shared your supplies when mine ran out. Figure I owe you." He glanced toward the cabin, though he couldn't see Clara through the window. "Besides, any woman desperate enough to run into the mountains in winter to escape Victor Harlan probably has good reason. I've heard stories about what he did to his last wife." Rowan studied Marcus for a long moment. Then he said, "If Keller asks, you didn't see anything." "Haven't seen you in months," Marcus agreed. "Good luck, Rowan. You're going to need it. Victor Harlan doesn't stop until he gets what he wants." "Neither do I," Rowan replied quietly. Marcus nodded once, then turned and disappeared back into the forest, his tracks the only evidence he'd been there. Rowan stood at the window for several minutes after Marcus left, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the trees. Finally, he lowered the weapon and turned to Clara. "We need to move," he said flatly. "Tonight, after dark. This cabin's compromised now." "But you said—" "I said I trusted Marcus, and I do. But he knew where to find us, which means others might figure it out too. Keller's running a grid search, which means they're being thorough. We stay here. They'll find us eventually." Rowan began moving through the cabin, pulling supplies from shelves, organizing them with quick efficiency. "There's another place, higher up, harder to reach. We'll be safer there." "I can barely walk," Claire protested, looking at her bandaged ankle. "I'll carry you if I have to." Rowan's tone left no room for argument. "But we're not staying here to get surrounded." Clara watched him pack: dried meat, flour, coffee, ammunition, medical supplies. Everything chosen for maximum utility and minimum weight. He moved with the calm of someone who'd done this before, someone for whom running was just another survival skill. "How long can we keep running?" Clara asked quietly. Rowan paused, a bag of cornmeal in his hands. "Long as we have to. These mountains stretch for 100 miles. I know places Keller's men will never find, places most people don't even believe exist. And then what? We hide forever? I become a hermit like you, living in the high country until winter or age or violence finally catches us?" "You stay alive," Rowan said harshly. "That's what. Everything else is luxury." Clara looked around the cabin. The careful organization, the military precision, the absolute absence of anything personal or soft or human. This was what survival looked like in Rowan's world. This was the price of freedom from men like Victor Harlan. And she realized with a cold shock that she was willing to pay it. "When do we leave?" she asked. Rowan met her eyes, and something like respect flickered in his expression. "Sundown. I'll scout the route, make sure it's clear. You rest that ankle as much as you can between now and then. It's going to be a hard climb." The day passed in tense preparation. Rowan methodically packed everything they'd need, then buried or destroyed everything else. He wouldn't leave supplies for Keller's men to use or evidence for them to study. Clara watched him work, memorizing the way he moved, the way he thought. Survival, she was learning, wasn't instinct. It was skill. It was knowing which supplies mattered and which didn't. It was understanding terrain and weather and human nature. It was being willing to abandon comfort for safety, settlement for movement, certainty for chance. Rowan Hayes had mastered these skills through 8 years of solitary exile. Now Clara was getting a crash course, and her life depended on learning fast. As the sun began to set, painting the snow gold and orange, Rowan made one final check of his weapons. He had his rifle, 2 pistols, a hunting knife, and a tomahawk. He moved through the cabin one last time, his eyes cataloging everything, committing it to memory or saying goodbye. Clara couldn't tell which. "Ready?" he asked. Clara tested her ankle. It still hurt, but the splint helped. She thought she could manage short distances if she was careful. "Ready." Rowan shouldered the pack he'd prepared, easily 60 pounds of supplies, as if it weighed nothing. Then he helped Clara to her feet, supporting her weight as she found her balance. "We'll move slow," he said. "Stop if you need to, but we don't turn back. Understood?" "Understood." They stepped out of the cabin into the twilight. The snow had stopped, and the air was crystalline clear, so cold it burned Clara's lungs. Above them, the first stars were appearing in a sky that seemed impossibly vast. Rowan led the way up a trail that Clara wouldn't have seen if he hadn't shown her, a narrow path that wound between massive boulders and ancient pines, climbing steadily higher into country that looked like the edge of the world. Behind them, the cabin stood silent and dark, already becoming just another abandoned structure in the endless wilderness. And somewhere below, 8 men searched through the forest with orders to bring Clara Whitlock back to Victor Harlan's possession. Dead or alive, willing or broken, it didn't matter. But with each step higher into the mountains, with each mile of frozen country between her and the valley, Clara felt something unexpected growing in her chest. Not just hope, which was too fragile. Not just determination, which was too brittle. Freedom. Real, dangerous, costly freedom. The kind you had to fight for every single day. The kind men like Victor Harlan couldn't steal because it didn't exist in ledgers or contracts or legal documents. It existed in cold air and starlight and the steady footsteps of a man who'd chosen exile over compromise, survival over surrender. Clara looked up at Rowan's broad back as he led her through the darkness, and she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't just survive what was coming. She would learn. She would become strong enough to stand beside this man instead of hiding behind him. She would earn the freedom he was helping her claim. And if Victor Harlan's men came for her again, they would discover that the frightened girl who'd climbed out her bedroom window was gone. In her place stood someone harder, someone forged by mountains and desperation and the fierce will to choose her own fate. Someone who would fight. The climb lasted 3 hours through darkness, so complete that Clara could barely see Rowan's silhouette ahead of her. The trail, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a series of careful footholds across icy rock faces and narrow ledges that dropped away into blackness. Her ankle screamed with every step, but she bit down on the pain and kept moving. Stopping meant freezing. Freezing meant death. Rowan moved with absolute certainty through terrain that would have killed most men even in daylight. He never hesitated, never second-guessed his route. When the path became too treacherous for Clara to navigate alone, he would backtrack, take her hand, and guide her across obstacles that made her stomach drop just looking at them. "Don't look down," he said quietly as they edged along a cliff face barely wider than Clara's shoulders. "Keep your eyes on where your next step goes. Nothing else matters." Clara pressed herself against the rock, feeling the void pulling at her back like gravity with malicious intent. Her fingers found holds in the stone, and she moved inch by terrifying inch, following Rowan's steady progress. When they finally reached solid ground on the far side, Clara's legs nearly gave out from relief and exhaustion. "We're close," Rowan said, steadying her. "Another quarter mile." Clara wanted to ask how he could possibly know where they were in this darkness, but she saved her breath for walking. The altitude made every breath feel insufficient, made her head swim with oxygen deprivation. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, trusting Rowan to lead them somewhere that wasn't the edge of a cliff.
The new cabin appeared so suddenly that Clara almost walked past it. Built into a natural cave formation, its front wall constructed from the same gray stone as the surrounding cliffs, it was nearly invisible, even from 10 feet away.
Rowan pushed open a door that blended seamlessly with the rock and gestured Clara inside. The interior was smaller than the first cabin, barely large enough for 2 people, but it had the same meticulous organization. Supplies lined shelves carved directly into the stone. A fire pit sat ready with kindling and logs. Furs and blankets were stacked in a dry corner. This wasn't a temporary shelter. It was a carefully prepared fallback position. "How many of these places do you have?" Clara asked as Rowan got a fire started. "Enough." He worked the flint and steel with practiced hands until flames caught and began spreading through the kindling. Learned early that having only one safe place makes you predictable. Predictable gets you killed. The fire grew, and warmth began pushing back the cold. Clara sank onto a pile of furs, her entire body shaking with exhaustion. She'd been running on adrenaline for so long that now, in relative safety, the crash hit her like a physical blow. Rowan glanced at her, and his expression softened slightly. "You did well. 3-hour climb on a bad ankle through terrain that's killed experienced mountaineers. Most people would have quit halfway." "Quitting wasn't an option," Clara said through chattering teeth. "No," Rowan agreed. "It wasn't." He pulled a blanket from the stack and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Get warm. I'm going to make sure we weren't followed." He disappeared back into the darkness before Clara could protest, leaving her alone with the fire and her thoughts. She pulled the blanket tighter and stared into the flames, her mind replaying the past days like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She'd run from her wedding, injured herself in the mountains, been rescued by a stranger who had every reason to turn her over to Victor's men, but chose danger instead. And now she was hiding in a cave at the top of the world while 8 armed men hunted her like an animal. This should have felt like failure, like she'd traded one prison for another, exchanged Victor Harlan's mansion for a stone cave and a life of constant flight. But it didn't feel like failure. It felt like fighting. It felt like choosing. And that made all the difference. Rowan returned after 20 minutes, snow dusting his shoulders, his breath pluming white in the cold air outside the cave. "Trail's clean. Storm's picking up again. We'll have another 6 inches by morning. Should buy us at least another day before Keller's grid search reaches this elevation." "And then what?" Clara asked. "We run again? Find another cave, climb higher, keep moving until we run out of mountain?" Rowan sat down across the fire from her, his face half in shadow. "You want the honest answer?" "Yes." "I don't know." He said it simply, without pretense. "I've been thinking about it since we left the first cabin. Keller's running a professional operation, grid search, multiple men, systematic coverage. That's not panic. That's Victor Harlan applying resources and organization to a problem he's determined to solve." "Me," Clara said bitterly, "I'm the problem." "You're the woman who told him no," Rowan corrected. "In Victor's world, that's unforgivable. He'll spend whatever it takes, risk whatever men he needs to, just to prove that nobody defies him and gets away with it." Clara pulled the blanket tighter. "So what do we do?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Clara's stomach clench. "We have 3 options. First, we keep running, keep moving higher and deeper into the wilderness until either Winter or Victor's men kill us. Maybe we survive the season. Maybe we don't." "That's the option you've been living for 8 years," Clara said quietly. "It is." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Second option, I take you to the territorial authorities in Montana, help you file a legal complaint against Victor for attempted forced marriage. Let the law handle it." "You don't believe that would work?" "No. Victor owns the law in this territory. You'd be back in his hands before the ink dried on your complaint, and I'd be arrested for kidnapping." Rowan met her eyes. "Which leaves the third option." "Which is?" "We go on the offensive." Rowan's voice was flat, but Clara heard the steel beneath it. "Stop running from Victor's men and start making it too costly for them to keep hunting. Make this search so expensive, so dangerous, so unprofitable that Victor decides you're not worth the trouble." Clara stared at him. "You're talking about fighting back. About what? Ambushing his men. I'm talking about making them afraid, Rowan said. Right now they're hunting because it's their job and the pay is good. We make them understand that hunting you means dying in these mountains, and suddenly that pay doesn't seem so good anymore. You'd kill for me? The question came out barely above a whisper. Kill men you don't know just to protect a stranger you met 3 days ago? Rowan's expression was unreadable. I've already killed for less. And you're not a stranger anymore, Clara. The moment I stood between you and Dutch Keller, you became— He paused, searching for words. My responsibility. My choice. And I don't make choices I'm not willing to defend. Clara felt something shift in her chest. A complicated tangle of gratitude and guilt and something else she couldn't quite name. I won't ask you to kill for me. I won't have more blood on my hands because I chose freedom over slavery. Then what will you ask? Rowan's eyes were intense, demanding honesty. Because doing nothing is also a choice. Running forever is a choice. Surrendering to Victor is a choice. You've been making impossible choices since you climbed out your bedroom window. What's one more? Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words. He was right. Every step of this journey had been a choice, terrifying, desperate choices made in moments when hesitation meant death. She'd chosen to run, chosen to climb into the mountains, chosen to trust a stranger with ice-blue eyes and a violent past. Now she had to choose again. Teach me, she said, opening her eyes to meet Rowan's startled gaze. Teach me how to survive up here, how to track, how to shoot, how to move through these mountains the way you do. If we're going to fight, I won't do it hiding behind you like a damsel in a fairy tale. I'll fight beside you. Rowan studied her face for a long moment. You understand what you're asking? Learning to survive in the high country takes years. Learning to fight takes longer. And we don't have years. We have days before Keller's search closes in. Then teach me what matters most, Clara said. Teach me enough that I'm not a liability. Enough that if something happens to you, I have a chance of making it out alive. Nothing's going to happen to me. That's what every soldier thinks before the battle that kills him, Clara said quietly. You told me about Elizabeth Brennan. You tried to save her alone and the system destroyed you for it. Don't make the same mistake with me. Let me help. Let me be more than just another woman you're trying to rescue. Something flickered in Rowan's expression. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition. He stood abruptly, moving to one of the shelves carved into the stone. When he returned, he was carrying a pistol, smaller than the ones he carried but still substantial. This was meant for close-range defense, he said, holding it out to Clara. Colt .38. Reliable, not too heavy. If you're serious about learning, we start here. He waited until Clara took the weapon, feeling its unfamiliar weight in her hands. First lesson. A gun is a tool, nothing more and nothing less. It's not power. It's not safety. It's not a solution to your problems. It's a tool that does exactly one thing, puts holes in whatever you point it at. Understand? Clara nodded, her fingers curling around the grip. Second lesson, Rowan continued. Never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. Not to scare, not to threaten. If you draw this weapon, it's because you've decided someone needs to die. That decision comes before your hand touches the gun, not after. The weight of the pistol suddenly felt much heavier. Have you made that decision? About Victor's men? Yes, Rowan said without hesitation. I made it the moment I faced down Dutch Keller. If his men come for you again, I'll kill them. Not because I want to. Because the alternative is handing you over to a man who'll break you the way he broke Sarah Harlan. He reached out and adjusted Clara's grip on the pistol. Now you need to decide if you can make that same choice. Because carrying a gun you're not willing to use is worse than carrying nothing at all. Clara looked down at the weapon in her hands. 3 days ago, she'd been a rancher's daughter preparing for a wedding she didn't want. Now she was holding a gun and discussing the conditions under which she'd be willing to kill another human being. The transformation should have horrified her. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long sleep, painful and disorienting, but ultimately necessary. I can make that choice, she said quietly. If it comes to that. If it's them or my freedom. She met Rowan's eyes. I didn't run from Victor Harlan's marriage bed just to let his men drag me back to it. If they force the issue, I'll fight. And if fighting means killing, then— She took a breath. Then I'll learn to live with that decision. Rowan nodded slowly. Then we'll start training at first light. For now, you need rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But sleep didn't come easily for Clara, despite her exhaustion. She lay wrapped in furs by the fire, the pistol nearby, her mind churning with everything that had changed and everything still to come. She could hear Rowan moving quietly around the cave, checking supplies, maintaining weapons, preparing for possibilities she could only guess at. Eventually, his movements stopped. Clara opened her eyes to find him sitting against the cave wall, rifle across his lap, watching the darkness beyond the entrance. A sentinel again, tireless and vigilant. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked softly. "Some," Rowan replied without turning. "Learn to get by on less than most people need. Mountains don't care if you're tired. Neither do the men hunting you." "What was it like? Before Cheyenne? Before you came to the mountains?" Rowan was silent so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Normal. I was a soldier. Had friends, responsibilities, a future laid out clear as a map. Thought I understood how the world worked." He shifted slightly. "Turns out I understood nothing. The world runs on power and violence, and everything else is just decoration. The mountains taught me that. Out here, there's no pretense. You're strong enough to survive or you're not. You're smart enough to adapt or you die. It's honest, at least." "It's lonely," Clara said. "Yes," Rowan agreed. "It's that too." Clara thought about loneliness, about the price of freedom and the cost of defiance. She thought about her family, her father drinking himself into compliance, her mother crying silent tears, her brother trapped in a system that would devour him eventually. She'd escaped, but they were still prisoners of debt and circumstance and Victor Harlan's casual cruelty. "My brother James," she said quietly. "He's only 14. If Victor can't get to me, he might—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Might hurt your family to draw you out," Rowan finished. "It's what I'd do if I were him. Use leverage against someone who won't be leveraged directly." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own escape that she hadn't fully considered the consequences for those she'd left behind. "I've condemned them. By running, I've made them targets." "You've given yourself a chance at life," Rowan corrected. "What your family chooses to do with that is their decision, not your responsibility. You can't save people who won't save themselves, Clara. You can only save yourself and hope it inspires others to do the same." "That's a hard philosophy." "It's a survival philosophy," Rowan said. "And it's kept me alive for 8 years in country that kills softer men." He finally turned to look at her. "Your father had a choice when Victor offered the marriage deal. He could have said no, could have lost his ranch and started over somewhere else, could have fought or fled or found another way. He chose the path that sacrificed you for his comfort. That's his burden to carry, not yours." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to defend her father's impossible position, but the words wouldn't come because deep down she knew Rowan was right. Her father had made a choice. So had her mother. They'd chosen their land and their debt over their daughter's freedom, and Clara had chosen to save herself. "Sleep," Rowan said again, more gently this time. "The world will still be complicated in the morning. Rest while you can." Clara closed her eyes, and this time exhaustion won. She fell into deep, dreamless sleep while snow fell silently outside the cave, and somewhere in the darkness below, 8 men plotted her capture. She woke to gray dawn light and the smell of coffee. Rowan was already up, heating water over the fire, moving with the quiet efficiency she was beginning to recognize as his natural state. "Ankle," he said without preamble. "How is it?" Clara tested it carefully. Still painful, but the swelling had reduced noticeably. "Better. I can probably walk short distances without the splint." "Keep the splint on anyway. We're not taking chances." Rowan poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink this, then we start your education." The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what Clara needed. She drank it gratefully while Rowan laid out weapons on a flat rock near the fire. The Colt .38 he'd given her, his own pistols, his rifle, the hunting knife, the tomahawk. "Most people think fighting is about strength," Rowan began, his tone shifting into something that reminded Clara of a military instructor. "It's not. Fighting is about will, leverage, and making better decisions faster than your opponent. Strength helps, but it's not what keeps you alive. He picked up the Colt. This weapon gives you reach and stopping power. It equalizes the physical difference between you and a larger opponent, but only if you can actually hit what you're aiming at. He spent the next hour teaching Clara the fundamentals: how to hold the pistol, how to sight along the barrel, how to control her breathing, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. They couldn't fire the weapon, not with sound carrying for miles in the thin mountain air, but Rowan made her practice the motions until they became muscle memory. In a real fight, you won't have time to think, he said, guiding her hands into the correct position for the 100th time. Your body needs to know what to do before your brain catches up. That's why we drill. That's why we practice until it's instinct. After weapons training came wilderness skills. Rowan taught Clara how to read tracks in the snow, how to tell fresh sign from old, how to identify the different patterns left by deer, elk, wolves, and men. He showed her how to move quietly through the forest, how to use terrain for concealment, how to cross open ground without being seen from higher elevations. The mountains are either your ally or your enemy, he explained as they crouched behind a boulder studying the valley below. If you understand them, they protect you. If you fight them, they kill you. Learn to think like the mountain, patient, ruthless, indifferent to comfort. Clara absorbed everything like a woman dying of thirst given water. Every skill Rowan taught her was another tool for survival, another increment of independence, another step away from being the helpless fugitive who'd collapsed by that creek. By midday, her ankle was throbbing and her muscles ached from exertion in the thin air, but she felt different, stronger, more capable. They were eating a quick meal of dried meat and hard biscuits when Rowan suddenly went still, his head cocked toward the valley below. "What is it?" Clara whispered. "Riders." Rowan moved to the edge of their position, staying low, his eyes scanning the distant tree line. 4 of them, moving parallel to the ridge about a mile south. Clara's heart began to race. "Keller's men?" "Has to be. No one else would be up this high this late in the season." Rowan watched the distant figures for several minutes. They're checking the canyons methodically. Won't find this cave, it's too well hidden, but they're getting close to the general area. "What do we do?" Rowan's jaw tightened. "We have a choice. We can wait here, hope they pass us by, and continue hiding. Or," he glanced at Clara, "or we can do what we discussed last night. Make them afraid." "How?" "There's a narrow canyon about 2 miles south of here. Only one way in, one way out. Good ambush position." Rowan's voice was clinical, tactical. "If those riders check that canyon, and if we're waiting for them, we could take out at least 2 before they know what's happening. The survivors would report back to Keller that hunting you isn't just difficult, it's deadly." Clara felt her mouth go dry. This was it. The moment where theory became reality, where the pistol in her belt became more than a symbol of defiance. "You're asking me to participate in an ambush," she said slowly, "to help you kill men who are just doing a job." "I'm asking you to help me protect your life," Rowan corrected. "Those men aren't innocent bystanders. They're hired guns who know exactly what they're doing. They're hunting a woman who doesn't want to be found, planning to drag her back to a man who'll beat her and break her and probably kill her within a few years. They're not doing this because they have no choice. They're doing it because Victor Harlan pays well." "And that makes it acceptable to kill them?" "It makes it necessary." Rowan met her eyes, his expression hard. "You wanted to fight beside me instead of hiding behind me. This is what that looks like. This is the reality of survival when powerful men want you dead or enslaved. You don't win by being more moral than your enemies. You win by being more committed to living than they are to capturing you." Clara looked down at the distant riders, tiny figures moving across the white landscape like ants. In another life, the life she'd lived just days ago, those men would have been abstractions, faceless employees of a cruel system she couldn't change. But that life was gone. That Clara was gone. The woman she was becoming understood that sometimes survival required terrible choices, that freedom had a price, and sometimes that price was paid in blood. "If we do this," she said quietly, "there's no going back. We're not just running anymore. We're declaring war on Victor Harlan." "We declared war when we refused to surrender," Rowan said. "This just makes it official."
Clara took a deep breath of the thin mountain air, feeling it burn in her lungs, feeling the weight of the decision settling over her shoulders like a physical burden. Then she thought of Victor Harlan's hands on her face, his threats against her brother, his promises of what her wedding night would bring. She thought of Sarah Harlan's bruises and screams and lonely death. She thought of every woman who'd been traded like property, beaten like animals, killed like they were nothing more than inconvenient possessions. And she made her choice. "Show me the canyon," Clara said. "Show me where we'll make our stand." Rowan studied her face for a long moment, and Clara saw respect dawn in his ice-blue eyes. "It's a 2-mile hike over rough terrain. Your ankle—" "My ankle will manage," Clara interrupted. "You said yourself, the mountains don't care if we're tired or injured. Neither do the men hunting us, so we stop caring too. We do what needs to be done." A ghost of a smile touched Rowan's lips. "You're learning fast." "I'm learning from the best teacher desperation can provide," Clara replied. They spent the next hour preparing, checking weapons, organizing ammunition, planning the approach to the canyon. Rowan moved with calm efficiency, explaining his tactical thinking as he worked. "An ambush succeeds or fails based on 3 things," he told Clara. "Position, surprise, and commitment. Position means choosing ground where you have every advantage and your enemy has none. Surprise means they don't see you until it's too late. Commitment means when you spring the trap, you don't hesitate. Don't second guess. Don't give them time to react." "And if something goes wrong?" Clara asked. "Then we retreat and regroup. I've already planned 3 escape routes from that canyon. We're not heroes, Clara. We're survivors. If the fight turns against us, we run and live to fight another day." By early afternoon, they were moving south along the high ridge, staying below the skyline to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Rowan led, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every rock and tree. Clara followed, her ankle throbbing but manageable, her mind focused on the violence she'd agreed to participate in. They reached the canyon Rowan had mentioned just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. He was right. It was perfect ambush terrain. The canyon was narrow, its walls steep and rocky, its floor covered in scattered boulders that would provide cover. There was only one entrance from the south, and it funneled directly into the killing zone Rowan had selected. "We position here," Rowan said, indicating a cluster of boulders on the eastern wall about 50 feet above the canyon floor. "Good sight lines, good cover, clear fields of fire. If those riders enter the canyon, they'll be directly below us with nowhere to hide." Clara looked down at the canyon floor and felt her stomach clench. This was real. This was happening. "What if they don't come?" she asked. "Then we've wasted a day and gained good intelligence about their search pattern," Rowan replied. "Either way, we learned something useful." They settled into position behind the boulders and waited. The sun moved across the sky with agonizing slowness. The temperature dropped. Clara's injured ankle went from throbbing to a dull, persistent ache that she forced herself to ignore. Rowan remained absolutely still beside her, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the southern approach to the canyon with inhuman patience. Clara tried to match his stillness, but found herself fidgeting, adjusting her position, checking and rechecking the Colt at her belt. "First time is always hardest," Rowan said quietly, not looking away from his surveillance. "Waiting for violence is worse than the violence itself. Your mind has time to imagine everything that could go wrong." "How do you stop it? The fear?" "You don't. You just learn to function despite it." He glanced at her briefly. "Fear keeps you alert, keeps you careful. It's when you stop being afraid that you make mistakes." Another hour passed. The sun touched the horizon, turning the snow gold in rows. Clara's muscles were cramping from staying motionless for so long, and she was beginning to think the riders wouldn't come, that they'd search a different area, that this whole plan had been— "Contact," Rowan breathed. "South approach. 4 riders, moving slow, checking the terrain." Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She could see them now, 4 men on horseback, exactly as Rowan had described, moving cautiously through the trees toward the canyon entrance. They were too far away to identify, but even from this distance, Clara could see the rifles they carried, could see the deliberate way they scanned their surroundings. Professional. Dangerous. Hunting. The riders reached the canyon entrance and paused.
Clara held her breath, watching as one of them dismounted and examined the ground, clearly reading sign, looking for tracks or evidence of passage. Please let them turn back, Clara thought desperately. Please let them decide the canyon's empty and move on. But the man remounted, said something to his companions, and the 4 riders entered the canyon in single file. Beside her, Rowan raised his rifle, sighting carefully down the barrel. His breathing was slow and controlled, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "When I fire," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "the survivors will scatter. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target. Don't shoot unless you're certain. Understand?" Clara nodded, unable to find her voice. The riders moved deeper into the canyon, their horses picking their way carefully across the rocky floor. They were 50 yards into the trap now, 40, 30, 20 yards directly below their position. Rowan's rifle spoke, a single crack that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. The lead rider jerked backward in his saddle and fell, hitting the ground before Clara's mind had fully processed what she'd seen. The other 3 men reacted instantly, spurring their horses, reaching for weapons, looking for the source of the gunfire, but they were trapped in the narrow canyon with limited cover and an enemy above them with the high ground. Rowan fired again. A second rider screamed and clutched his shoulder, barely staying in his saddle as his panicked horse bolted back toward the canyon entrance. The remaining 2 men had found partial cover behind a boulder and were returning fire now, bullets sparking off the rocks around Clara and Rowan's position. "Stay down," Rowan ordered, calmly working the lever on his rifle, chambering another round. "Let them waste ammunition." The gunfire was deafening in the confined space. Clara pressed herself against the boulder, her hands over her ears, the Colt forgotten in her belt. This was nothing like the careful instruction of the morning. This was chaos and noise, and the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the knowledge that men were dying because of choices she'd made. Rowan fired twice more in quick succession. One of the remaining riders went down. The last man, realizing he was alone and outmatched, abandoned his cover and ran for his horse, desperate to escape the killing ground. He almost made it. Rowan's final shot caught him as he reached his mount. The man fell forward across his saddle, and his terrified horse carried him back down the canyon toward the entrance, disappearing into the trees. Then silence crashed over the canyon like a physical force. Clara's ears rang. Her hands shook. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that she couldn't control. Below them, 2 men lay motionless on the canyon floor. A third, the one Rowan had shot in the shoulder, had made it out of the canyon and was presumably fleeing back toward wherever Keller's main camp was located. The 4th had escaped, wounded but alive. "We need to move," Rowan said, already gathering his equipment. "They'll report back. Keller will know within hours that his men were ambushed. He'll respond with force." Clara couldn't move. She stared down at the bodies below, her mind unable to process what had just happened. "Clara," Rowan's voice cut through her shock, "I need you to move, now." "We killed them," Clara whispered. "We killed 2 men." "I killed them," Rowan corrected firmly. "You were here, but I pulled the trigger. That's on me, not you." He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "But this is what fighting back looks like. This is the price of freedom when men like Victor Harlan refuse to let you walk away. Now I need you to stand up, and I need you to move, because staying here gets us killed." Clara took a shuddering breath and forced herself to her feet. Her legs felt like water, but they held. They descended from their position using a different route than they'd climbed up, moving quickly but carefully. Rowan paused only once to retrieve weapons and ammunition from the bodies, practical even in the aftermath of violence. Clara couldn't look at the fallen men, couldn't let herself think about whether they had families, whether they were just desperate men taking a dangerous job, whether they deserved what had happened to them. She focused on following Rowan, on putting distance between themselves and the canyon, on survival. They'd made their choice. They'd drawn a line in the snow and blood. And Victor Harlan would have received their message loud and clear. The runaway bride wasn't coming back quietly. She wasn't coming back at all. And anyone who tried to take her would pay in blood. They traveled through the night, pushing hard through terrain that would have been treacherous even in daylight. Rowan set a punishing pace, and Clara forced herself to keep up despite her screaming ankle and lungs that burned with every breath of the thin mountain air. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the darkness and the distance and the blood they'd left behind in that canyon didn't say louder. By dawn, they'd put nearly 10 miles between themselves and the ambush site, climbing higher into country so remote that even the game trails disappeared into bare rock and ice. Rowan finally called a halt in a narrow crevasse between two massive granite slabs where the wind couldn't reach them and their fire wouldn't be visible from below. Clara collapsed immediately, too exhausted even to help as Rowan built a small fire from deadwood he'd carried in his pack. Her hands were still shaking. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the lead rider falling from his saddle, saw the bright spray of blood against white snow, heard the echo of gunfire trapped between canyon walls. "Drink this." Rowan pressed a canteen into her hands. "You're dehydrated. Altitude and exertion both steal water from your body faster than you realize." Clara drank mechanically, the water tasteless on her tongue. When she lowered the canteen, she found Rowan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're in shock," he said quietly. "Normal reaction to violence. Give it time." "How much time did it take you?" The question came out sharper than Clara intended. "After your first kill. How long before you stopped seeing it every time you closed your eyes?" Rowan was silent for a moment, feeding small sticks to the growing fire. "I was 19. Apache raiders hit a supply wagon I was escorting, killed the driver, wounded 2 soldiers. I shot one of the raiders off his horse." He stared into the flames. "Took me 3 months before I could sleep without seeing his face. Even now, 16 years later, I remember exactly what he looked like when he fell." "Does it get easier?" "No," Rowan said flatly. "It gets familiar. That's not the same thing." He looked at her directly. "I won't lie to you, Clara. What happened today will stay with you. Maybe forever. The question isn't whether you'll remember it. You will. The question is whether you'll let it destroy you or whether you'll carry it as the price you paid for freedom." Clara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling cold despite the fire. "I thought I was ready. I thought I'd made peace with what fighting back would require. But then I saw those men fall, and I realized—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Realize that killing isn't abstract," Rowan finished. "That it's not heroic or noble or clean. It's just death. Messy and permanent and impossible to undo." He poured coffee from a pot he'd set on the fire. "Anyone who tells you different is either a liar or a monster. And anyone who does it without feeling something is already broken inside." "Are you broken?" Clara asked softly. Rowan handed her a cup of coffee, his scarred hand steady. "Probably. 8 years alone in the mountains, living like an animal, trusting no one. Yeah, I'd say something's broken in me. But at least I'm still breathing. At least I chose this instead of having it forced on me." They sat in silence, drinking bitter coffee and listening to the wind howl across the peaks above them. Claire's mind kept circling back to the ambush, replaying it from different angles, searching for some way it could have gone differently, some path that didn't end in blood. "They'll come harder now," Rowan said eventually. "Keller will report back to Victor that 2 men are dead and 2 wounded. Victor will either escalate or he'll cut his losses. Either way, the next few days will tell us everything we need to know." "What do you think he'll do?" Rowan's expression was grim. "If I were Victor Harlan, I'd double the men, triple the reward, and bring in professionals. Men who don't care about easy money, men who take pride in finishing difficult jobs. Trackers, bounty hunters, maybe even former military scouts." He met Clara's eyes. "And I'd make it personal. Make it about my reputation instead of just recovering property. Because now it's not just about getting you back. It's about proving that nobody makes him look weak." Clara felt ice forming in her stomach. "So we've made things worse." "We've changed the game," Rowan corrected. "Before, you were just a runaway bride, valuable but not worth dying for. Now you're a symbol. Run from Victor Harlan, and not only do you escape, you kill the men he sends after you. That's a story that spreads. That's a story other people in his empire might start believing." He stirred the fire with a stick. "Victor can't let that story survive, which means he can't let us survive." "Then what do we do? We can't fight an army." "No," Rowan agreed. "We can't. But we can make Victor's army not want to fight us. Fear is a powerful weapon, Clara. Right now, every man in Keller's search party is thinking about those 2 bodies in the canyon. They're wondering if they'll be next.
They're weighing their pay against their lives. He looked at her. We just need to tip that balance a little further. Another ambush? Not yet. They'll be expecting that now, moving in larger groups, taking precautions. Rowan pulled a rough map from his pack and spread it on the ground between them. But there are other ways to make men afraid, psychological warfare, make them feel hunted instead of being the hunters. Clara studied the map, seeing nothing but topographical lines and elevation markers. I don't understand. Keller's men need supplies, Rowan explained. Food, ammunition, shelter. They're probably operating from a base camp somewhere in the valley, sending out search parties each day. If we can find that camp, we can make their lives difficult. Steal their horses, foul their water, leave signs that we're closer than they think. He traced a line on the map. Make them paranoid, make them jump at shadows, make them argue about whether the pay is worth the stress. You want us to go on the offensive again? I want us to control the narrative, Rowan said. Right now, Victor controls it. He's the powerful rancher whose bride ran away. We're the fugitives hiding in the mountains. But if we start hitting back, if we make him look weak and disorganized and unable to protect his own men, the story changes. His finger tapped the map. Stories have power out here. Reputation matters. We turn Victor from a fearsome emperor into a bumbling fool who can't even catch one woman, and his whole empire starts to crack. Clara saw the logic, but the cost made her hesitate. More violence, more blood. Maybe, Rowan admitted, or maybe just enough harassment that his men quit and go home. Either way, we stop being passive targets. We become active threats. Before Clara could respond, a sound echoed across the mountains, faint but unmistakable. Gunfire. Multiple shots, rapid and panicked, from somewhere far below their position. Rowan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, scanning the distant valley through the narrow opening of their crevasse. Clara joined him, her fatigue forgotten. What is it? She whispered. What's happening? I don't know. Rowan's eyes tracked across the landscape below, searching for the source of the gunfire. Too far away to be directed at us. Sounds like panic fire. Like someone shooting at shadows. The shots continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly. Silence rolled back across the mountains like a held breath. Keller's men, Rowan said slowly. Has to be. They're spooked, jumping at every shadow, firing at nothing. He lowered his rifle slightly, and something like satisfaction crossed his face. The canyon ambush worked better than I thought. They're not just cautious now, they're afraid. Good, Claire said, surprising herself with the venom in her voice. Let them be afraid. Let them understand what it feels like to be hunted. Rowan glanced at her, and Clara saw approval in his eyes. You're learning the most important lesson. Survival isn't about being nice or fair or merciful. It's about being more committed to living than your enemies are to killing you. They spent the rest of that day resting and planning. Rowan sketched possible locations for Keller's base camp, based on water sources and terrain features. He explained the principles of guerrilla warfare. Hit fast, hit hard, disappear before the enemy can respond. He taught Clara how to move silently through different types of terrain, how to use darkness as camouflage, how to think like a predator instead of prey. Clara absorbed it all with desperate intensity. Every skill was another tool for survival. Every lesson brought her closer to being able to stand beside Rowan instead of behind him. As evening approached, Rowan made a decision. I'm going down tonight, alone. Going to scout for Keller's camp, get an accurate count of his forces, see what kind of security they're running. I'm coming with you, Clara said immediately. No. Rowan's tone was absolute. Your ankle's not healed enough for the kind of movement this requires. And if something goes wrong, if I get caught or killed, you need to be safe up here where you can disappear deeper into the mountains. I'm not letting you take all the risks while I hide in a cave. You're not hiding, Rowan said firmly. You're being strategic. I've done this kind of reconnaissance hundreds of times. I know how to move unseen, how to gather intelligence and get out clean. You'd be a liability right now, and we both know it. The words stung because they were true. Clara's ankle was better but not healed. She'd learned the basics of wilderness survival but was nowhere near Rowan's skill level. If he got into trouble because he was trying to protect her, they'd both die. How long will you be gone? She asked, hating the fear in her voice.
12 hours. Maybe less if I find the camp quickly. Rowan began preparing his equipment, dark clothing, weapons, supplies stripped down to absolute essentials. If I'm not back by dawn tomorrow, you take the supplies I'm leaving here and you head north. There's a trading post about 40 miles from here, across the territorial line into Montana. Ask for a man named Jacob Thorne. Tell him Rowan Hayes sent you. He'll help you disappear. I don't want to disappear without you. Rowan paused in his preparations and looked at her. For a moment, the hard mask he wore slipped, and Clara saw something raw beneath it. Concern, maybe, or something deeper he wouldn't name. I'll be back, he said quietly. I've survived worse odds than this. But if I'm not, if something goes wrong, you need to promise me you'll save yourself. That you won't do something foolish like trying to rescue me. I can't promise that. Clara, no. She met his eyes steadily. You told me I had to choose whether to fight or surrender. I chose to fight. That means I don't abandon allies. That means if you're in trouble, I help, even if it's foolish, even if it gets me killed. Rowan stared at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his harsh features into something almost gentle. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most stubborn. Can it be both? Yeah, Rowan said softly. I suppose it can. He finished his preparations and moved toward the crevasse opening. Stay hidden. Keep the fire small. And Clara? He looked back at her. If you hear gunfire, don't come running toward it. Promise me that much at least. I promise to think very carefully before running toward gunfire, Clara said. That's the best you're getting. Rowan shook his head, but he was still smiling. Then he disappeared into the gathering darkness, moving with the silent grace of a hunting cat, and Clara was alone. The night stretched out long and cold and full of imagined terrors. Clara kept the fire burning, kept watch at the crevasse opening, and tried not to think about all the ways Rowan's scouting mission could go wrong. She practiced the pistol drills he'd taught her, working through the motions until her hands stopped shaking. She cleaned and rechecked her weapons. She did everything she could to stay busy, to keep her mind from spinning scenarios where Rowan didn't come back. Hours passed. The moon rose, painting the snow silver. Clara dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, her hand automatically reaching for the Colt at her belt. She was half asleep when she heard the voices. Clara's eyes snapped open. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it, a trick of wind and exhaustion. Then she heard it again, faint but unmistakable. Men talking, somewhere close. Too close. She moved carefully to the crevasse opening and peered out into the moonlit darkness. At first she saw nothing, then movement caught her eye. 3 figures picking their way across the rocky slope about 200 yards below her position. Keller's men. Had to be. They were searching the high country, checking every possible hiding spot. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. If they continued on their current path, they'd pass within 50 yards of the crevasse. If they had a tracker with them, if they saw signs of the fire or footprints in the snow, if they investigated the crevasse, she had seconds to make a decision, stay hidden and hope they passed by, or take action. Clara thought of Rowan, alone somewhere in the valley, counting on her to stay safe. She thought of the promise she'd made not to do anything foolish. Then she thought of the alternative, being discovered, being captured, being dragged back to Victor Harlan after everything she'd sacrificed for freedom. She made her choice. Moving quickly and quietly, Clara extinguished the fire, scattering the coals and covering them with dirt. She gathered Rowan's pack and her own small bag, slinging them across her shoulders. Then she drew the Colt and positioned herself in the deepest shadows of the crevasse, where she'd be invisible until someone was right on top of her. The voices grew closer. Clara could hear them clearly now. Waste of time. She's probably frozen to death by now. Keller says we search every square mile, so we search.
Yeah, and meanwhile, Hayes is out there picking us off one by one. Did you see what he did to Miller and Thompson? Clean shots from ambush. We should be hunting him, not some scared girl. We hunt who Keller tells us to hunt. You want to argue with him? Be my guest, but I'm not dying for a woman I never met. The 3 men passed the crevasse entrance, their boots crunching on frozen snow. Clara held her breath, the Colt steady in her hands, ready, but not eager to fire. They walked past without seeing her hiding spot. Their voices faded into the distance. Clara waited a full 5 minutes after they disappeared before allowing herself to breathe normally. That had been too close. The search net was tightening. If Keller had men this high in the mountains, if they were checking even the most remote hiding spots, she and Rowan were running out of safe places. Clara was still processing this realization when she heard a different sound, a single set of footsteps approaching fast from the opposite direction. She raised the Colt, her finger on the trigger, her heart racing. A figure appeared at the crevasse entrance, backlit by moonlight. "It's me," Rowan's voice said quietly. "Don't shoot." Clara lowered the weapon, relief flooding through her so powerfully she felt dizzy. Rowan slipped into the crevasse, breathing hard, his face grim. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "A serious problem." "Keller's men just passed by here," Clara said. "3 of them, searching the high country." "I know, I saw them from below." Rowan pulled off his pack and sank down against the rock wall. "I found Keller's camp. It's bigger than I expected. He's got 20 men now, maybe more. And that's not the worst part." "What's the worst part?" Rowan met her eyes, and Clara saw something she'd never seen there before. Genuine concern bordering on fear. "Victor Harlan is with them," Rowan said. "He came up from the valley this afternoon with reinforcements and supplies. He's running the search personally now." Clara felt the world tilt. "Victor's here? In the mountains?" "Saw him myself. He's set up in a large command tent, brought maps and professional trackers, brought enough supplies for a month-long campaign." Rowan's jaw tightened. "This isn't just hired guns doing a job anymore, Clara. This is Victor making it personal. He's not going to stop. He's going to comb these mountains inch by inch until he finds you." "Then we run," Clara said, forcing steel into her voice. "We go deeper, higher, somewhere even he can't follow." "There is no deeper," Rowan said harshly. "We're already in country that kills experienced mountaineers. Go much higher and we're talking permanent snow, ice fields, passes that are closed 6 months of the year. And it's only going to get worse as winter sets in." "So what are you saying, that we surrender?" "I'm saying we're trapped," Rowan said. "Victor's below us with 20 men. Winter's coming from above. We can't run much farther without dying from exposure, and we can't go back without being captured." Clara felt panic rising in her chest, threatening to choke her. They'd come so far, fought so hard, killed men and sacrificed everything for freedom. And now Rowan was telling her it might all be for nothing. "There has to be another option," she said desperately. "You said you knew these mountains. You said you could always stay ahead of them." "I lied." Rowan's voice was flat. "Or maybe I just believed it myself because I'd never faced an enemy willing to commit this many resources. But the truth is, with 20 men running an organized search and Victor Harlan's money backing them, they'll find us eventually. Could be days, could be weeks, but they'll find us." Clara stared at him, seeing the defeat in his eyes, and something inside her snapped. She hadn't run from her wedding, climbed mountains with a broken ankle, and watched men die just to give up now. "No," she said firmly. "No, we don't surrender. We don't quit. If running won't work, we do something else." "Like what?" Rowan asked, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, hope, maybe, or curiosity about what she'd say next. Clara thought fast, her mind racing through options and discarding them just as quickly. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide indefinitely. They couldn't fight 20 armed men in open combat. But maybe they didn't have to. "You said Victor's making this personal," Clara said slowly, an idea forming. "That he's here in the mountains, running the search himself. So?" "So he's vulnerable. He's out of his empire, away from his power base, exposed in terrain where his money doesn't matter." Clara leaned forward. "What if we don't run from him? What if we go after him directly?" Rowan's eyes widened. "You're talking about assassinating Victor Harlan." "I'm talking about ending this," Clara said. "As long as Victor's alive, he'll never stop hunting me. He'll spend every dollar he has, send every man he can hire. But if Victor dies," she let the implication hang. "His empire falls apart," Rowan finished slowly. "His men go home because there's no one left to pay them. The debt against your family dies with him. The hunt ends." "Exactly." Rowan was silent for a long moment,
his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. You understand what you're proposing, not just killing in self-defense or ambushing armed men who are hunting you, but deliberate, premeditated assassination of a specific target. That crosses a line, Clara. That makes you something different. I crossed the line when I chose freedom over slavery, Clara said quietly. Everything since then has just been following that choice to its logical conclusion. Victor Harlan decided I was his property. I decided I'd rather die than accept that. Now I'm deciding that if one of us has to die for this to end, it won't be me. Rowan studied her face in the dim light filtering into the crevasse. You've changed, he said finally. The woman I pulled out of that creek 5 days ago wouldn't have said those words. The woman you pulled out of that creek 5 days ago was still half slave, Clara replied. She's gone. I killed her when I killed the first of Victor's men. What's left is someone who understands the world you tried to teach me about. The world where survival goes to the most committed, not the most moral. A slow smile spread across Rowan's face. Then I guess we're planning an assassination. He pulled his map out again, studying it with fresh eyes. It won't be easy. Victor will have guards. He'll be cautious, especially after the canyon ambush. But you can get us close, Clara said. You can find a way in. Maybe. Rowan's finger traced paths on the map. There are approaches we could use, ways to reach his camp without being seen. But even if we get there, even if we somehow get past his guards and reach his tent. He looked up at her. Are you prepared to kill him? Not in the heat of battle, not from a distance with a rifle, but up close, looking him in the eyes, pulling the trigger? Clara thought of Victor's hands on her face, his threats against her brother, his promises of violence disguised as marriage. She thought of Sarah Harlan's screams and bruises. She thought of every woman Victor had broken and every man who'd stood by and let it happen. Yes, she said simply. I can do it. Then we'll need a plan, Rowan said. A good one, because we'll only get one chance at this. If we fail, if we're captured alive. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what Victor would do to them. They spent the next hour planning, arguing details, refining the approach. Rowan knew the terrain, knew how guards positioned themselves, knew how to move through an enemy camp unseen. Clara contributed what she knew about Victor, his habits, his arrogance, his tendency to underestimate women. By the time false dawn began to gray the eastern sky, they had a plan. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, and depended on luck as much as skill. But it was a plan. And more importantly, it was action. It was refusing to be victims, refusing to run forever, refusing to let Victor Harlan's cruelty define their lives. We move tonight, Rowan said. Give ourselves the full day to rest and prepare. Then after dark, we go down. And we end this, Clara added. One way or another, Rowan agreed. They sat in silence as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow gold and rose, turning the frozen peaks into something beautiful and deadly and utterly indifferent to human concerns. Somewhere below, Victor Harlan was waking in his command tent, confident that his resources and determination would eventually flush his runaway bride from hiding. He had no idea that the hunted had just become the hunters, that the frightened girl running through the mountains had transformed into something dangerous, that tonight, under cover of darkness, two people with nothing left to lose would be coming for him, and that before the next dawn, one way or another, this hunt would finally end. They slept in shifts through the day, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. Clara found sleep impossible at first, her mind churning with what they were about to attempt. But eventually exhaustion claimed her. She dreamed of wedding dresses soaked in blood and ice-blue eyes watching from shadows, and Victor Harlan's face twisted in rage as he reached for her throat. She woke to Rowan's hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. Sunset in an hour, he said quietly. Time to prepare. Clara sat up, her body stiff and sore, her ankle throbbing dully. She tested it carefully and found it stronger than yesterday. Not healed, but functional. It would have to be enough. Rowan had laid out their equipment with military precision, weapons cleaned and loaded, dark clothing, rope, a wicked-looking knife he'd sharpened to a razor edge. He handed Clara the Colt and a small pouch of extra ammunition. Remember everything I taught you, he said. Stay close, stay quiet, follow my lead exactly. If something goes wrong, if we get separated, you head north toward that trading post I told you about. Don't look back. Don't try to help me. Just run and survive. We've been through this, Clara said, checking her pistol with movements that were becoming automatic. I'm not leaving you. Then don't make me regret bringing you along. Rowan's voice was hard, but Clara saw the concern in his eyes. This isn't like the canyon ambush. We're walking into their stronghold, surrounded by armed men, trying to kill the most powerful rancher in the territory. The margin for error is 0. I understand the stakes. Do you? Rowan stepped closer, his voice dropping. Because if they catch us, they won't just kill us, Clara. Victor will make an example. He'll make it slow and public. He'll make sure everyone in the territory knows what happens to people who defy him. His hand touched her face, surprisingly gentle. I need to know you can do this, that you can kill if necessary, that you won't freeze when it matters most. Clara met his eyes steadily. I ran from my wedding into frozen mountains where I should have died. I watched you kill 2 men and didn't break. I climbed cliffs that terrified me and learned to shoot and chose to become a killer rather than a victim. She placed her hand over his. I'm not the same person I was a week ago. Whatever I need to be tonight, I'll be it. Rowan held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's finish this. They left the crevasse as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that reminded Clara uncomfortably of blood and fire. Rowan led them down through terrain he'd scouted earlier, moving from cover to cover, using the failing light to mask their descent. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness fell. Clara's breath plumed white in the air, and ice formed on her eyelashes. She followed Rowan's silent form through the twilight, trusting his knowledge of the land, forcing herself to step where he stepped and avoid where he avoided. After an hour of careful movement, Rowan held up a hand for Clara to stop. They crouched behind a cluster of boulders while he surveyed the terrain ahead. There, he whispered, pointing to a faint glow in the valley below. That's their camp. I count 6 fires, which means they've spread out more than yesterday. Victor's tent will be the large one in the center. That's where I saw him earlier. Clara studied the distant campfires, trying to judge distances and positions. Even from here, she could see men moving between the fires, hear the faint murmur of voices carried on the cold wind. How do we get close without being seen? She asked. Same way I did last night. There's a creek bed that runs within 50 yards of the camp's eastern edge. It's deep enough to hide us if we stay low. Rowan gestured toward a dark line cutting through the snow. We follow that, get to the camp perimeter, wait for the guard rotation, then we move. What's the guard rotation? They change every 2 hours. During the changeover, there's about 90 seconds when positions are being transferred and attention is divided. That's our window. Clara felt her stomach clench. 90 seconds to cross 50 yards of open ground, reach Victor's tent, kill him, and escape. It seemed impossible, but so had everything else she'd survived this past week. They moved toward the creek bed, descending carefully through loose rocks and ice. Clara's ankle protested each step, but she gritted her teeth and ignored the pain. Pain was temporary. Capture was forever. The creek bed was shallow and frozen, providing just enough depth to hide them if they moved in a crouch. Rowan led them along it, stopping frequently to listen, to scan the darkness, to ensure they remained unseen. The camp grew closer. Clara could hear voices now, could smell wood smoke and cooking meat, normal sounds of men settling in for the night, unaware that death was creeping toward them through the darkness. Rowan stopped where the creek bed came closest to the camp and pulled Clara down beside him. They were perhaps 60 yards from the nearest fire now, close enough to see individual men moving around the flames, close enough to hear conversations. There, Rowan pointed to a large tent in the center of the camp, illuminated from within by lamplight. Through the canvas, Clara could see a shadow, a man's silhouette, sitting at what looked like a table or desk. That's Victor's command tent. 2 guards at the entrance, probably 2 more inside. 4 men, Clara whispered, plus Victor. How do we wait for the rotation, Rowan interrupted. When the guards change, the new ones need a minute to get briefed by the old ones. Everyone's focused on that handoff. That's when we move. They settled in to wait, pressed against the frozen earth of the creek bed, watching the camp. Minutes crawled by. Clara's body began to go numb from the cold, but she didn't dare move. Movement meant discovery. Discovery meant death. A commotion near one of the fires caught Clara's attention. Men were arguing, their voices raised enough to carry across the camp. "I'm telling you, we should pack it in," one man shouted. "Hayes killed 2 of us in that canyon. 2 good men dead for what? A woman who's probably frozen to death by now?" "Keller says we keep searching," another voice replied. "Victor's paying good money." "Victor's paying blood money. I signed on to track a runaway bride, not fight a war against a mountain man who shoots like the devil himself." "Then quit and go home," a third voice said coldly. Clara recognized it instantly. Dutch Keller. "But you don't get paid, and you don't come back to this territory looking for work." Victor Harlan remembers who stands with him and who cuts and runs. The argument continued, but Rowan wasn't paying attention to it. He was watching the guards at Victor's tent. "Get ready," he breathed. "Rotation's coming." Clara saw it now, 2 new guards approaching the tent, walking with the casual confidence of men who didn't expect trouble. They reached the entrance and began talking with the current guards, gesturing, exchanging information. "Now," Rowan whispered. They moved together, rising from the creek bed and crossing the open ground in a low run. Clara's ankle screamed, but adrenaline drove her forward. 50 yards, 40, 30. A shout rang out behind them. "Movement! East side!" Rowan grabbed Clara's arm and they dove behind a supply wagon just as rifle fire erupted across the camp. Bullets tore through the darkness, sparking off rocks, shredding canvas. "We're compromised," Rowan said, pulling his pistol. "New plan. We fight our way to Victor and finish this fast." The camp exploded into chaos. Men scrambled for weapons, shouting orders and warnings. The guards at Victor's tent moved to defensive positions, rifles raised. Rowan fired twice, dropping 1 guard. Clara surprised herself by firing as well, her shot going wide but forcing the other guards to take cover. They ran toward the tent, using the confusion to close the distance. They were 10 yards away when Dutch Keller stepped out from between 2 tents, rifle already aimed. "End of the line, Hayes," he said calmly. Rowan's pistol came up, but Keller was faster. His rifle barked, and Rowan jerked backward, red blooming across his left shoulder. "No!" Clara screamed, raising the Colt. She fired 3 times in rapid succession. The first 2 shots missed, but the third caught Keller in the leg. He went down, cursing, his rifle falling from his hands. Clara grabbed Rowan, trying to support his weight. Blood poured from his shoulder, hot and dark. "Can you move?" "Have to," Rowan gasped. He transferred his pistol to his right hand, his left arm hanging useless. "Get to Victor. Finish this." They staggered toward the command tent. Behind them, men were regrouping, organizing. They had maybe seconds before being overwhelmed. The tent entrance was unguarded now, the guards having moved to engage the threat. Rowan kicked the canvas aside and they stumbled through. Victor Harlan stood behind a field desk, a pistol in his hand, his face twisted with rage and triumph. "Clara," he said, almost gently, "my beautiful, foolish bride, did you really think you could kill me? In my own camp, surrounded by my men?" He aimed the pistol at Rowan. "I'm going to kill your mountain man first. Make you watch. Then I'm going to take you back to the valley and marry you. And every day of your miserable life, you'll remember this moment and know that defying me was the worst mistake you ever made." Clara's hand found the Colt at her belt. Time seemed to slow. She could hear Rowan's labored breathing beside her, could see Victor's finger tightening on the trigger, could feel the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. She'd run from a wedding, climbed mountains, learned to kill, transformed from victim to fighter. And now she would finish it. Clara drew the Colt and fired in one smooth motion, exactly as Rowan had taught her. The shot was instinctive, guided by muscle memory and desperate will rather than conscious thought. The bullet caught Victor Harlan in the chest. His eyes widened in shock. The pistol fell from his hand. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his expensive shirt, then up at Clara, his expression shifting from shock to disbelief to rage. "You," he gasped. "You shot me. You actually—" Clara fired again, and again, each shot pushing Victor backward until he collapsed against the tent wall and slid down it, leaving a red smear on the canvas. Victor Harlan, powerful rancher, cruel husband, self-proclaimed emperor of the Wyoming Territory, stared at Clara with dying eyes. "You were never going to own me," Clara said quietly. "Not then. Not ever." Victor's mouth worked, trying to form words. Then he went still, and the light left his eyes. Clara stood frozen, the Colt still raised, smoke curling from its barrel. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Victor Harlan was dead. "Clara!" Rowan's voice cut through her shock. "We need to move. Now!" The sound of men shouting outside the tent broke the spell. Clara turned to see Rowan clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face pale but determined. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Can you run?" he countered. They burst out of the tent together into absolute chaos. Men were running in all directions, some toward the tent, some away from it. The camp had dissolved into confusion and panic. Leaderless, disorganized, every man suddenly uncertain about what to do or who to follow. Claire and Rowan ran for the darkness beyond the firelight. Bullets chased them, but the shots were wild, panicked. They reached the creek bed and dove into it, scrambling along its length, while shouts and gunfire echoed behind them. "They're not pursuing," Rowan gasped after several minutes. "They're arguing. Some want revenge, some want to cut their losses and go home." He stumbled, and Clara caught him. "Without Victor to pay them, to organize them, they're just a mob." "We need to get you somewhere safe," Clara said, seeing how much blood Rowan was losing. "That shoulder—" "We'll keep until we're clear of this area," Rowan insisted. "Move first. Survive first. Everything else comes after." They climbed through the darkness, putting distance between themselves and the dying camp. Behind them, the shouting continued, but no organized pursuit developed. The men Victor had hired were mercenaries, not soldiers. Without their employer to give them purpose and payment, they had no reason to risk their lives hunting a wounded mountain man and the woman who'd killed their boss. By dawn, Clara and Rowan had reached a small cave Rowan knew about, high enough and remote enough that they could rest safely. Clara built a fire while Rowan collapsed against the wall, his face gray with blood loss and pain. "Let me see the shoulder," Clara said, already moving to help him remove his shirt. The wound was ugly, a through and through that had missed bone but torn muscle and tissue. Clara cleaned it with whiskey from Rowan's pack, packed it with clean cloth, and bound it tight to stop the bleeding. Rowan endured the treatment in silence, his jaw clenched against the pain. "You did good," he said finally, when Clara had finished. "The shooting, the escape, all of it. You kept your head when it mattered." "I killed a man," Clara said quietly. "Not in an ambush, not from a distance. I looked Victor Harlan in the eyes, and I killed him." "Yes," Rowan agreed. "You did. How do you feel?" Clara considered the question honestly. She waited for guilt, for horror, for the crushing weight of taking a human life. Instead, she felt lighter, like a burden she'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. "Free," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, completely free." Rowan smiled, though it turned into a grimace of pain. "That's the right answer. Victor Harlan spent his life enslaving people, with debt, with violence, with fear. You ended that. However many women he would have hurt, however many families he would have destroyed, you stopped it all." He closed his eyes. "The world's a better place without him in it." They rested through the day, taking turns sleeping and keeping watch. By evening, Rowan's shoulder had stopped bleeding, though his face remained pale and his movements careful. "We should stay here a few days," Clara said. "Let you heal." "No." Rowan struggled to his feet. "We need to keep moving. Get across the territorial line into Montana, disappear for a while. Once word spreads about Victor's death, there'll be questions, maybe a federal marshal investigation. We need to be long gone before that happens." "Where will we go?" Rowan looked at her thoughtfully. "I told you about that trading post, Jacob Thorne's place. He owes me favors, and he's good at helping people start over with new names and new lives." He paused. "Or if you'd rather, I can take you to Butte. Mining town. Lots of opportunities for someone willing to work. You could build a life there, far from anyone who knew you as Clara Whitlock." "What about you?" Clara asked. "What will you do?" "What I've always done. Disappear into the mountains. Live alone. Stay one step ahead of civilization and its complications." But Rowan's voice lacked conviction, and his eyes stayed on Clara's face. Clara stood and moved closer to him. What if I don't want to go to Butte? What if I don't want a conventional life in a mining town, working some respectable job, pretending to be someone I'm not? Then what do you want? Clara looked around the cave, at the rough stone walls, the simple fire, the basic tools of survival. A week ago, this would have seemed like poverty and hardship. Now it seemed like possibility. I want to learn, she said. Really learn. Everything you know about surviving in the high country. I want to become someone who doesn't need civilization's protection, who can stand on her own, who can't be bought or sold or forced into anything ever again. She met Rowan's eyes. I want to stay with you, if you'll have me. Rowan stared at her, something unreadable in his expression. You understand what you're asking. Life up here is brutal, lonely, hard in ways you can't imagine until you've lived it for years. I've had a taste of it, Clara said, and I'm still here, still standing, still choosing it over the alternative. The winters will try to kill you. The isolation will make you question your sanity. There's no comfort, no security, no guarantee of survival from one day to the next. But there's freedom, Clara countered. Real freedom. Not the kind that depends on a man's mercy or society's rules or playing a role someone else wrote for you. The kind you take for yourself and defend with your life. She stepped closer. You taught me that. You showed me what it looks like to choose your own path, no matter how hard. I don't want to go back to civilization and spend the rest of my life wondering what if. I want this. I want to be here. Rowan reached out with his good hand and touched her face, his scarred fingers gentle against her skin. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. You'll have moments when you regret this choice. I'll have more moments when I'm grateful for it. Clara leaned into his touch. I'm not asking for easy, Rowan. I'm asking for honest, for real, for a life that's mine instead of something traded away to pay someone else's debts. Rowan pulled her closer, and Clara felt something inside her settle into place. A rightness she'd never felt before. This hard, dangerous man who'd saved her life had become something more. Partner, teacher. The first person who'd ever seen her as something other than property or obligation. Then stay, Rowan said quietly. Learn, survive, build something here that's yours. Ours, Clara corrected. We build it together. They stayed in that cave for 3 days while Rowan's shoulder healed enough for travel. During that time, Clara practiced her shooting, learned to set snares for small game, studied the patterns of weather in the high peaks. Rowan taught her constantly, sharing knowledge accumulated through 8 years of solitary survival. On the 4th day, they packed their supplies and headed north toward Montana, moving carefully through terrain that was both beautiful and deadly. They traveled for a week, staying high, avoiding settlements, leaving no trail that anyone could follow. The trading post Rowan had mentioned turned out to be a collection of rough buildings in a valley where 3 territories met, a place where the law was thin and questions were unwelcome. Jacob Thorne was a grizzled former trapper who took one look at Rowan's healing shoulder and Clara's determined expression and asked no questions. Heard interesting news from down south, he said as they warmed themselves by his fire. Seems Victor Harlan died. Some say it was bandits, some say it was one of his enemies, some say it was a ghost. He smiled, showing gaps where teeth should have been. Whatever it was, folks down there are saying his empire's falling apart, debts being forgiven, families getting their land back, whole territories in chaos, but the good kind of chaos. The kind where little people suddenly got room to breathe. Clara felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Her family would be free. Her father's debt erased with Victor's death. James safe from threats and leverage. They'd survived, and she'd given them that by choosing her own survival first. We need supplies, Rowan said to Thorne. Winter gear, ammunition, food stores. We're heading deeper into the backcountry. Both of you? Thorne looked at Clara with curiosity. Both of us, Clara confirmed. Thorne nodded slowly. I can outfit you. Though I gotta say, miss, most women wouldn't choose this kind of life. The mountains are hard on folks who weren't born to them. I wasn't born to them, Clara said, but I was reborn in them, and I choose them over any alternative civilization offers. They left the trading post 2 days later, loaded with supplies, heading into country so remote that even trappers rarely ventured there. They found a valley ringed by peaks with good water and thick timber, and they built a cabin together, stronger than Rowan's previous ones, large enough for two, positioned where they could see anyone approaching from miles away. That first winter tested Clara in ways she couldn't have imagined. The cold was brutal, the isolation absolute. There were days when she questioned her choice, when she thought about warm houses and easy lives and the civilization she'd left behind. But there were more days when she stood on the cabin's porch and looked out at the vast wilderness surrounding them and felt nothing but profound gratitude. Gratitude for freedom, for survival, for the hard-won skills that kept her alive, for the man beside her who'd helped her transform from victim to equal. Spring came eventually, melting the snow and revealing the land beneath. Clara had survived her first mountain winter. She was leaner now, stronger, her hands calloused from work, her eyes sharp from constant alertness. She could shoot as well as Rowan, could track game through the forest, could read weather in the clouds and danger in the wind. She was no longer Clara Whitlock, the rancher's daughter sold to pay her family's debts. She was something new, something forged by choice and hardship and the absolute refusal to be owned by anyone or anything. One morning in late spring, Clara stood on a high ridge overlooking their valley while Rowan checked the trap lines below. The sun was warm on her face. The air smelled of pine and melting snow and possibilities. She thought about the girl who'd climbed out her bedroom window a year ago, terrified and desperate, choosing uncertain death over certain slavery. That girl had run into the mountains and found a mountain man with ice-blue eyes. She'd learned to fight, to survive, to choose her own path. She'd killed the man who'd tried to own her, and she'd discovered that freedom wasn't something given or granted. It was something claimed, defended, paid for in blood and hardship and the daily choice to keep fighting. Clara touched the pistol at her belt, her pistol now, a tool she'd mastered, a symbol of self-reliance, and smiled. Behind her, she heard Rowan's footsteps on the trail, returning from the trap lines. She turned to meet him, this man who'd chosen exile over compromise, who'd taught her that survival was a skill and freedom was a decision. "Good haul," he said, holding up 3 rabbits. "We'll eat well tonight." "We always do," Clara replied, falling into step beside him as they walked back toward the cabin. They'd built this life together, hard and honest and utterly their own. No empires, no debts, no one to answer to except themselves and the mountains. And as they reached the cabin and began preparing the evening meal, Clara understood something fundamental about the story she'd lived. It wasn't a story about a runaway bride who got rescued. It was a story about a woman who rescued herself, who chose freedom over comfort, truth over safety, hardship over slavery, who learned that the price of that freedom was eternal vigilance and the willingness to defend it with everything she had, and who discovered, in the wild silence of the mountains and the company of someone equally committed to living free, exactly who she was meant to be all along. The story would spread, as stories do. The tale of Victor Harlan's mysterious death, the runaway bride who disappeared into the mountains and was never found, the mountain man who'd faced down hired guns and vanished like smoke. But Clara didn't care about the stories people told. She cared about the truth she lived every day, and that she was free, that she'd earned it, that she'd defend it, and that no empire, no debt, no powerful man would ever take it from her again. The wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of wild sage and freedom. And in a small cabin hidden in the high country where money meant nothing and power couldn't reach, Clara Whitlock, who'd left that name behind along with everything it represented, stood beside the fire, a pistol on her hip and a smile on her face, and knew she was finally, completely, irrevocably home.